Excellent. Right, I think we will get going. I think we're definitely quorate. Right, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining our webinar. The first in our little mini series on profitable pricing. My name is Esther Carder and I'll be lightly chairing today's session. Many of you know us well already, but for those of you who don't, we're leading accountants and advisors in the media industry, working with clients right across the marketing services, film, TV, theatre and media tech sectors. And our clients range right from startups right through to sort of multinational private equity backed AIM-listed groups. And we're part of Moore Kingston Smith, which is a top 15 accountancy and advisory firm, which in turn is part of Moore Global, which is an international network. So very well placed to help our clients with international growth in a very joined up way. So price pressure from clients isn't exactly a new topic. Clients have been demanding more for less from agencies for quite a long time now. And many of you will be familiar with the annual survey that we do, which looks at the KPIs across the whole of the marketing services industry. About 250 companies feature in that survey. And if we look at the averages of the profit margins over the last sort of 4 or 5 years, there's definitely a downward decline rather than an uptick. And we did a survey earlier this year asking MDs and FDs what they thought the outlook for the coming year was. Actually, it was quite bullish, to be fair. We'll see whether that turns out to be reality or not. But when we asked them what they were concerned about for this year, one of the things that many of them were greatly concerned about was price pressure from clients. And not very many agencies feeling that they were going to be able to put their charge out rates up. However, when we then compared the number that were sort of planning on putting their charge out rates up compared to those that were planning on giving pay rises to their staff, there was definitely quite a gap between the two, which is obviously concerning because, of course, the further away those two things move, the further margins are going to be squeezed. So we thought it'd be interesting to run a mini series of webinars, which I have creatively called, or not very creatively called, as an accountant, profitable pricing. It kind of was a working title and it just stuck because I couldn't think of anything better. To hear from sort of industry advisors and agencies who are looking at things a bit differently, trying to ensure that, agencies get paid fairly and profitably for the work that they do. And of course, this involves getting your pricing right in the first place and obviously dealing with those tricky conversations with procurement. So I'm delighted today to welcome Tracey Shirtcliff and Ian McLellan, who are going to be talking about how agencies can move away from selling hours and start selling what they are delivering. So a very short little bit of information about each of them. So Tracey is the CEO and founder of the Virtu Group, which has created the award-winning scope pricing and management tool for agencies. And this is on the back of having started and exited a very successful workflow and resource planning tool that she developed called Agent Traffic Live, and that was for agencies as well. And this was an industry-leading software which was running in sort of nearly 1,000 agencies globally. She's also started and ran her own agency. She's worked client-side as head of marketing for Royal Bank of Scotland and held senior marketing roles at British Gas and Forte Hotels. Ian is currently worldwide head of programme management at Ogilvy. He has an unrivaled wealth of experience running projects and client accounts at agencies, and he's previously held senior roles at RGA, Isobar, TMW and Sapient, to name a few. And I'm told Ian is strategic with a no-nonsense, results-orientated and collaborative approach, which I'm sure will shine through today. So, like I said, I'm going to be sort of lightly chairing this and asking Ian and Tracey a few questions. I'd be absolutely delighted if everybody would sort of pitch in with their own questions as we go along, and I'll sort of try and weave those questions into Tracey and Ian. Please do put them in the Q&A function rather than the chat function. It's much easier for me to keep track what's going on if you put them in the Q&A function, so stay away from the chat function. Super, right, so I think we'll start off with sort of the obvious question really. The title and the topic of this webinar is sort of moving the needle and stop selling hours and start selling what you're delivering. I guess coming to you first, Tracey, what do you really mean by this?
Well, I think firstly, let's just kind of pick off the elephant in the room, which is around the whole kind of question on pricing. So there's a well-established quote from McKinsey that's been around for several years, and it's basically about a 1% increase in price is an 8% increase in profitability. So the topic of your series is around profitability. So it's as if we can increase our price, we can of course increase our profitability if everything else is consistently held the same, at an unbelievable margin uptake. So from where we come, from scope, we're all around stopping talking about hours and roles and starting to talk about the value of what you're delivering in the deliverable. And we believe that that will allow you to be able to, with better systems and processes, to be able to find that 1% price increase in an easier way, and certainly also to justify that. The key thing is when we look at the whole kind of historical question of where pricing came from, and this is literally going back 40 years ago when creative broke off from media. It was created to the concept was, you know, how are we going to charge for the creative now? It's separate from the media, and we're not simply going to make it from the media commissions. So they gave that challenge to a CFO somewhere, and they went to the back office and they said, well, what are we paying for Tracey and Ian and Harpreet, and we're going to add a margin on top of that. We're going to add a markup, and cost plus was born. And that has been the way that industry has charged for the last 40 years. And roll in over the last 40 years enormous amounts of complexity on the things that we're delivering. So we've now got digital, we've now got social, search, you know, out of home, all of these things that we never, packaging, in-store, all of these things we never had before. So, and we're stuck with this old crazy model of charging for hours and roles, which doesn't talk about actually what we're delivering and the value and what's involved. So we're all around owning that and making it more structured and putting in a process that can help agencies to better deliver that. And more importantly, finally from me, and I'll hand over to Ian to comment, is, you know, we even do this pricing process in Excel and Word. You know, these are great tools, but they're certainly not designed for managing pricing of very intricate projects. And we're not talking, you know, you don't talk just about roles and people in a project, you talk about what you're delivering. So I think that there's also a big kind of challenge in the process, and the tools just aren't fit for purpose. So that's why we think you should be not talking about hours and roles, which is historical, and moving to the value. Ian, it'd be great for you to chip in with your experience.
Well, firstly, thank you for inviting me to this. Tracey, I echo your point on value. I think that's the framing, as I understand it, for this session, is how can agencies create the most business value when it comes to pricing. And I think part of that we'll talk through, I think, a little bit on the areas of improvement that agencies can do. But I think having that focus on the, you know, if you go back to Simon Sinek's golden circle, right, we have a tendency to jump straight from the why to the what. And I think there's the gap in the middle. We'll talk a little bit more in depth on that, but the how, and then defining, okay, what are our objectives for this particular campaign? How are we measuring, you know, our key results, both from a qualitative and quantitative perspective? So again, echoing Tracey's point on driving business value, both for our clients and our own agency as well.
Because it always staggers me, you know, you're right. The industry has got itself in this position where it just sort of, everything is about time and like you say, spreadsheets of people and roles and salaries and markups and absorption costing. It staggers me that this is what procurement expect to see, and what lots of agencies, not all my clients to be fair, but many clients will give them. I mean, presumably that's been your experience over the years in the various agencies you've worked in, Ian.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think, you know, having the levels of seniority in terms of the roles and the number of hours, these are really important data that we need, but it's foundational data. It doesn't need to be front and center in a conversation with procurement or client, or even with our own teams. I think, you know,
quite.
You know, one of the interesting tensions, as I'm sure everybody realizes, is between our creative and strategy and the PMO when we start talking about hours, when, you know, creators are thinking about ideas. So I think there's an opportunity for us to move away from focusing on the foundational data and, again, driving that value. That's for me is an interesting narrative.
I agree. The idea that accountants or lawyers might share similar data with their clients is unthinkable. So, I mean, let's talk a bit about the mistakes then that agencies are making with the whole way they go about doing the pricing for the work they do, and why is it that they're making these mistakes? Is it just because they just don't know any other way?
Well, I'd like to frame it as areas of improvement rather than mistakes, but I think there are learned behaviors where, it's almost like the mantra is, we've always done it this way. So it takes a certain level of boldness to aim to transform the ways of working. If we go back to this conversation on value, as soon as you start to change the narrative on value, you can then start to change the behavior. So I think there are some foundational behavioral changes that agencies need to implement. And I think there's maybe confidence is an important part of that, because without confidence to have conversations of value, we end up being at more of a client vendor perspective rather than the partnerships that we really want. So if we look at that, what's the output of that is, again, we focus, and again, it's a gross generalization when I say we, because I can't speak for every agency, but in my experience, we jump straight to the what we are delivering and forget about the conversation on aligning that to a client strategic vision. So if we think of a traditional campaign, we'll maybe take that brief verbatim without kind of thinking, okay, do we need to challenge some of the thinking in here? Could we kind of give a differing perspective? So this perception of speed is that we have to jump really quickly.
Yeah.
So I think that's and again, it's a generalization, but I think that's inhibiting us from creating value, I think.
Yeah.
Well, I have a little bit of a different view because, of course, I had the joy of having run a very successful project management and workflow tool for 10 years, Traffic Live. And ironically, when I exited that business, I wasn't ready to hang up my boots in this industry, which I love and very passionate about. But what was really clear to me is I spent a lot of my time talking to C-suite, CFOs, CEOs. They put in, resource planning and workflow tool, and they're like, it's great, Tracey, there's margin point improvements, but we're still losing money on some projects and some jobs and across clients. What is going wrong? And so it was pretty quick for me to be able to investigate. And of course, we had all the data that we had from this business to look at it and go, oh my goodness, they're re-estimating everything every time. They're talking about roles and people. There's no consistency. There's not even a taxonomy. If we've done it before, can we use some similar language? If we got the same brief, we'd put together different things. We may even start with an Excel template. Not ideal, because there's no way to kind of control that or kind of put any other the systems and things around it that you would have with a workflow tool. And more importantly, when it got to workflow, you had to talk about what you were delivering. So why would you talk when you're at pricing around hours and roles when actually delivery is about what we're doing? So for me, it was pretty easy to take that whole movement from, and I think we talked about it earlier, roles and hours is the input that agencies use to work out what they're doing, the output. So it's about bringing that whole discussion forward so we can scope and price better. So armed with all of this knowledge and industry pieces, I couldn't leave the problem unsolved. So with a team, we put together and we built scope. And scope is all around getting consistency of something in a global platform to allow you to do this whole process better. You don't need to use our tool, but you certainly need to stop from talking about the input pieces that it's absolutely about your business and start talking about the things that you're delivering of value for your clients. It doesn't cease to amaze me, but you wouldn't go into Boots and pick up, a product from the market, from the shelf and go, oh, Dove, I've looked at the ingredients on the back and I've added those all up and I'm going to put 20% on top of that and that's what you're going to pay. No, that's not value. So why would we do that with what we do at agencies? It just doesn't make any sense at all. So for me, the common mistake is that we're just adopting the status quo, which was okay 40 years ago. We don't even deliver that same stuff anymore, and we're completely different businesses, so we need to do it differently.
Yeah, and I think from a more tactical perspective, one of the areas in which I always encourage, my teams to focus on is the moment the brief comes. So whatever level fidelity, that could be a spoken word brief or a very detailed written one, is really take the time to apply a level of critical thinking. Look at what is that requirement from a holistic perspective. Because if you take the time at the beginning of the process, we all know you're going to be setting yourself up for success within the project. That also allows you to create a far more robust statement of work when you've got all of the varying inputs. So it's almost like take the extra day that's needed to analyze, not only from yourself, with your client, with your teams, really get under the skin of what that requirement is, set your objectives and key results, and then the scoping and pricing model can form far more readily from that. And I think what I've learned in my experiences is that agencies do this, but do they do that consistently or 100% of the time? Maybe that's up for discussion.
So you're saying that perhaps agencies rush in with the whole scoping and pricing, and they should take a bit more time to go through it more thoroughly?
Yeah, I think if you focus on the brief, not only is the scoping going to improve, but also, the strategic rationale for what we're doing. You're going to have a much better understanding. If you take time with your clients and your teams, the creative output is going to improve. Or whatever that output will be as part of the brief, it will improve if we've interrogated the brief.
I think that improvement is kind of one of those really key cornerstones, because if you're talking about roles and hours and then you're delivering things, the two are just misaligned. Even from when you're talking about ROI for a client, it's like, it's just, it's like water and fire. So, and doing it in Excel again is one of those things that's around, tools not fit for purpose. So, you build this pricing, your scope or proposal in Excel, then you might even put it to Word, so those two don't talk together. And then you might put timesheets back. Well, what were the people working on? We're talking about total hours. And then of course we never use that information to update what we're actually pricing for. It's just to check against that one instance where we built it bespoke. So we believe if you're going to do timesheets and put in the rigor that involves, then take that time back to what people are actually delivering in the output, not the input, and then you can monitor whether you're charging the right thing for the output, which is why we bring time back into our system. It's critical. Why would you measure all this time if you don't know what people are effectively doing as part of the output, not the input?
And does this apply equally to, because obviously retainers and projects are quite different things to price and scope. I mean, it sounds as if it's very applicable to projects, but is this sort of methodology applicable to retainers as well?
Well, my view on that, and I'm going to let Ian speak, I'll be really quick, is that a retainer is just a number of hours that you've committed your partner, your client partner, to for the year, and then so you're still producing your campaigns or your outputs. So for us, we just simply have like a baseline of hours, and you just drop on what you're doing. And real time, it should keep that in check, because the work that's done manually to allow that to be able to done, I mean, there's hours and hours wasted of your CFOs and your valuable, expensive people to kind of keep this in check, when it's really just you've kind of sold something ahead of time because you're trying to get them to commit to the talent, which is a very wise sales move in my humble opinion. And then what you're delivering are just outputs again, and you just load those on, and the money or the time that's burning should just come off in real time, and then you know where you are at any point. Hopefully you're in the up, not the down, but allows you to manage it in real time. Ian, I'm sure you've got a really great...
I agree. I think the principles of project management apply the same for retainers as they do for just standalone projects. Always encourage, even when we're doing long-term planning, to give an indication of the scale and complexity of the projects that will be within a retainer. to get a sense of what the levels of seniority of staff that are going to be needed, even if you don't necessarily know the number of hours. It's directional. So I think everything that we're talking about now, the focus on the brief, applying the rigor within the tools and the process, will apply regardless of any commercial model, in my view.
I mean, I guess the question that's come in sort of follows on nicely from that is, how do you move a client that's used to paying for hours and days more to a value-based fee approach? Because I guess it's easier with new clients, but what about those that have been doing it for the last few years in a different way?
Well, there's not going to be one size fits all for every client, but I think going back to the point is that there is enormous value in looking at the hours and the levels of seniority and the roles, but that's the foundational data. It just, in my view, should not be front and center when we're discussing delivering any type of work for our client. We're talking about the strategic value of what the agency is providing to the client first, in my view, aligning on that, and then you work through and say, what's that foundational data looking like now we've agreed our strategic proposition? And if you do it in that order, I think it becomes easier to navigate.
We've already seen industry-wide that there's already a move by procurement to talk about what's being delivered. Some people hang on to the hours and the roles, so that it could be at some point you still need to present that information. But we believe it's a transition, and you can choose some clients who will move there and get it really quickly and get the value, and there's others which will take longer, but it's a movement over time. We've worked with a lot of agencies in managing that change process. There's also, I don't know whether anybody has heard of Tim Williams, but he runs a pricing council, which is all around the kind of the consultancy piece of how agencies can move themselves to this talking around the output and not the input. The input doesn't actually mean anything to a client. They don't know what level of seniority they should have to produce these things. I mean, that's the specialty of the agency. It goes back to walking into Boots and picking up that bottle of Dove. I have no idea what it takes to make a bottle of Dove and what I get inside it in the process and bits and pieces. So talk to me about what Dove is and whether I want that, absolutely. But don't talk to me about the ingredients and the makeup. So it goes back to that, whether we're talking about the individual pieces, the what should be the value that the agency gives, knowing the right teams, the seniority and the right roles to put on it to produce your output, inputs versus output.
I've got a good question, sort of links it, do COVID times lend themselves to strategic pricing, given that clients are much more cost focused at the moment, or is this just going to make it more difficult?
Well, I'm going to jump in on this one, because for me, one of the challenges is if they are on a retainer or they've committed to a number of campaigns, then the last thing you want them to do is cancel those and then not do anything. So it's really around what it is that you can swap quite quickly. And the whole concept of talking about outputs means that you can move from one output to another quite quickly. You don't need to talk about the team and what the makeup is. And that's just a distraction for people. So we've kind of seen the opposite, that if you're talking around the difference from selling time to selling deliverables, it should be more flexible. It should be fast to change something in and out. You're talking about what we're going to do as a change, not we don't need to change the team. Good question, though. Great question. I think it's also really around what the value is of talking about outputs for procurement. You have a taxonomy of what you can be delivering. It's more quantifiable. All of those things. It gives them more visibility of what they're actually getting. It just seems to make more sense. It's historical that we got to that point of talking about seniority and roles and how it was kind of put together. I mean, I would say lazy, coming from having had a very successful software package that ran project management workflow. That was for the agency internally to make their processes better. I'm still at a loss of why we would share that with the client, when the specialty of the agency is knowing how to deliver their wonderful service and their assets.
I mean, the framing of the question is, we're in a pandemic, and I know we're talking about pricing, but this is nearly over 18 months. It's fairly unprecedented for all of us. So I don't think we yet can count the human cost of this. Everybody is under a lot of pressure. I think there is always time to remind ourselves of the why we're doing what we're doing, regardless of the scale of the work. Whether it's a simple social post all the way through to very large campaign, which are very COVID focused, for example. So my view is, always have that front of mind. Why are we doing what we're doing? Because I think, as Tracey's alluded to, sometimes you need to pivot. Sometimes the client has new pressures that they've not been aware of when they've briefed the agency. And so I think this is where the opportunity comes into developing more of a partnership mindset with our clients.
Yeah.
And that way you become much more closer. You inhabit the strategic view, and then agencies can move from that.
It's also the importance of talking about value, what you're doing, not the teams, isn't it? Because intrinsically, that comes with a better conversation and a better narrative.
It's an order of conversation, isn't it? You just don't start with the what, do you?
Exactly. I mean, so the next question I had actually ties in quite nicely with a couple of questions that people have got, because obviously we've got inputs, we've got outputs, and then we've got outcomes, haven't we? And obviously what you're talking about definitely moves us from inputs to outputs, but sort of how far along the journey to measuring outcomes does this sort of move along? And somebody's asked, how do you define value to the client? Things like commercial growth, sales, risks, the costs, and all of that.
For me, I think we have to, that is at the moment of the brief where you do that definition. You need the right people in the room who are going to be able to partner with the client on determining what those business objectives, what the consumer objectives are. And then, the measurement of that could be a qualitative or it could be a quantitative measure. So you might be looking at, product sales growth in a particular market, but you could also be tracking consumer sentiment. So regardless of those metrics, I think the opportunity is to apply that rigor on every brief. The client is spending money, and therefore we should be measuring what the success of that would be. So that becomes the outcome definition. So in my view, then the process of scoping and pricing falls from that objective and key result setting.
Yeah, it's funny. I get this a lot, and understandable because of kind of what we do and kind of where I sit. I had a call from the 4As in the US probably about, just as COVID hit about 18 months ago, and I gave a presentation to their global CFO group, and they asked the very same question: how do we go how do we go to value-based pricing or outcome-based pricing? And for me, if you're at the input place, you have to stop talking about time and hours. So you need to move to things first. And then once you've got the point of pricing for things, then you can talk about pricing for the thing and then the uplift of value that thing can deliver. So it's developing the framework, but you have to have made the step. There's no way you can have gone from talking about hours and roles to, we're just going to pitch it for value. Well, you could, but you're not going to get paid in the right way. And let me tell you about why that's important, because there's certain things in the set that you will deliver as outputs. So let's take a competitive review. I think they're fundamentally important to any piece of work that you're doing for a client. And there's a lot of work that goes into those, and so it should be. But a competitive review is an output. If I'm looking at that as value, as an outcome value, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to measure. Because, where is the uplift? Well, I might not see anything, but the knowledge and the information that gives you is unparalleled and unreferenced in making better choices to the other things that will increase the outcomes. So for me, that would always be, competitive review, call it whatever you might want, would always be something that you would need to charge for the output. So there would always be a fee involved in doing that work. It's never going to be linked to outcomes. Whereas if you do a campaign, yes, of course, and you've said, we put in, a framework, but you also still want to be charged for the thing that you're doing. Like a lot of the work what is the upside of that? So you still have to be in the output to go to the outcomes. The other one is the caveats involved. I've heard it before where agencies have been burnt with this outcomes piece. And I'm just going to use a really simple example, which was they produced a whole campaign and they agreed all the metrics, and the client was going to roll it out to 200 stores. They ended up to do a trial and rolled it out to 25 stores. Of course, they never got the outcome and the upshot because the client didn't put it out. That wasn't covered. So if they had put it in that they got paid, you know, something for the output and then the upside are on the outcome, which is how the framework should work. It's complex, but you need to have moved off time and materials and hours and roles from the input piece over to the output piece before you can even have that more strategic and more engaged conversation. I'm all around making that happen because I think that's where agencies need to be. But it's, you know, we've got a lot of maturing to go. Over to you, Ian.
I know I was echoing what you're saying. There's the foundations need to be applied before I think you can be quite serious in, okay, what is the value-based pricing? If you don't have those foundations in place, it's going to be very difficult. So I echo that, Tracey.
Yeah, I mean, there's a comment here, but to your point, Tracey, around the only rolling out to 25 stores, you know, somebody said, well, doesn't value imply agencies have full ownership of the output and results? We all know there are a number of factors outside the agency's control which can play into the value, some positive and some negative. And I guess that's unavoidable, really. So you've got to best frame the measurement of those outputs to the things, I guess, that you do have some control or most control over.
Agree, and I think that's why the importance of upfront planning. This is why, you know, the sort of risk mitigation. If you do that at the beginning, you've got a better chance of managing some of those scenarios that were in the question, because you've at least taken the time.
Yeah, I mean, somebody said here, how best should we be researching clients? You know, the client's perceived use, values, and any tips on how you sort of best have those conversations with your target clients?
Just on a human level, you know, set the agenda for what you know, a meeting with your client for what you want to achieve and the purpose of that, and what the value of having that conversation is with the client, how it benefits them. I think that's for me is one of the roles of an agency, to be a partner with the client and provide a perspective, you know, that they need from us.
I mean, in terms of having, you know, there's a lot of questions coming in, having skin in the game. I mean, I've been talking about this with my clients for donkey's years, but it feels as if it is still very much at the margin. And to your point, Tracey, maybe that's where it should just be at the margin, because you should get paid for the thing that you do, and then there should be a rider if you're
talking about output, you can automatically disconnect the hours and the roles, so you can start to charge value for what you're delivering. So you don't have to go, well, you know, to produce this you know, strategic review or competitive review, oh, it's going to take 10 hours of Ian and 15 hours of Esther and 20 hours of Tracey. You can say, well, we know in the marketplace our competitive reviews are second to none, so we're going to charge £9,000 for that. It doesn't need to be linked to the hours. That's the whole point. That's why we want to move to outputs. Then if you want to then put the outcomes or value on top of that, that's another and separate conversation. But, you know, the inputs is the thing that should be done to make sure you're making money as a business, not sharing that with the client. The real reason that we're not at outcomes or the outputs already is because we're just an industry that's a bit lazy, and it's difficult to put in place change. But I think we have to own it, and the upside is massive if we start to, you know, the teams will know what we're selling, we know what we're good at. You know, I've worked with literally thousands of agencies, and, you know, I hear a lot, oh, we do everything. Great. So then I don't know how you price for everything. If you have at least a standard book or what I call a playbook of the things that you deliver, then start to price for those and put value in those and a narrative around what it is that you're delivering.
I think, to use the phrase skin in the game, I think if a commercial business leadership want to explore those commercial models, let's give a scenario, if you've got a new product that's being launched and you're developing, you know, a product with the client team, and you want to get 1% of all sales revenues as part of what you're delivering. That's wonderful to explore that, and should continue to do that. But unless you've got the foundations in place at the beginning of the process, I think they end up being disconnected, and it gets a little confusing in my view. So I think it's about laying foundations, strong business acumen, the tools in place, the pricing, scoping, etc. And then having the commercial and business leadership explore these new sort of value-based pricing models, in my view.
And what are your views generally on success fees? If a question come in on whether they are a good thing or not, or maybe sort of what percent, should there be a target amount of fee income of an agency that success fees should comprise?
From my point of view, I think it's on a case-by-case basis. And
yeah,
I just don't think you can.
I think for some brands you probably can do it, in others it's almost impossible, I think.
Exactly. I've had that conversation before. The global marketing director of Visa said there's no way we would ever entertain paying an agency on outcomes. I was like, it's quite, you don't know what the future might hold. And then you've got others who will entertain it. So I think it is a client by client basis. But I think the real thing here is about making sure that you have the framework and the rigor to be able to move to that, because, we're not doing, we're having a conversation now about how we increase pricing profitability from a hours and roles perspective. So we're a long way away. I think it's a journey, and I think it's something that as an industry we need to engage and work out how to do it better. I like to think we're challenging that and leading that from the front, because we all want to be paid for the value that we deliver. It's the win-win, isn't it? And that's the challenge sometimes of having to deal with procurement, is making them understand that this is a better way for their marketing teams to talk about what they're getting, not the teams and the roles and the seniority and the hours. I mean, that means nothing to what they're actually receiving.
Somebody's asked, what's your starting point for defining the value behind a thing or a deliverable? So if an agency places a value on a deliverable, how does the client then determine if that value is actually reasonable or not?
For me, that's a negotiation, is the starting point. I think, again, to go back at the beginning of when the brief is the input to the agency is the moment you should be having that conversation. We determine what the value is. An agency will have a perspective, an outside-in perspective, and the client will have a perspective. I think the key thing is to make sure those are aligned before the work starts.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I believe that to start to move to output, you do need the input. So you baseline it or underlie it with the hours and the roles. And this is certainly the work that we've done working with Ian and his team in developing a taxonomy and a baseline for the outputs that Ogilvy produce for their teams. So underneath that, with our tool Scope, we used a whole load of industry data, which we put through a very clever process of AI and big data to get us a taxonomy and a list of outputs that we could relate hours and roles to. You can key your own rates and your own seniority of teams into it, and it will tell you kind of a baseline what you should be paying for that thing. We start with hours, but we want you, at any point, you can click on the interface of the product and say, we want to turn that into a fixed price, because you should be able to do that. Because we think that disconnecting the inputs at some point on your pricing is the way to kind of gain this 1% really easily. But, it's one of those things. It's, you could just start charging for an output, but people have comfort if they can put the inputs underneath it to know that that's exactly how they made it up. And it's the same thing with moving to outcomes later. As long as you're getting paid at least what you think it's worth for the output, the outcome is then on the uplift, and that's important. You still get paid. You don't make it purely on an outcome element. There is still an input output an output outcomes element to this.
And I think it echoes the need, I think, for all agencies to establish those foundational aspects of scoping and pricing, because, you know, using retrospective scopes and directionally the data that you get, how well did you deliver on a previous scope? What was the value of what that project brought? You can use that retrospective data to inform the new brief. You know, often agencies will get direction from a client that they want, you know, a similar campaign to last year, but maybe with a few different add-ons, for example. So once you've applied those foundations and you're following the same rigor, same approach, you start to have better data. And I think, just to echo Tracey's point, this is, you know, it's a mixture of external data that you'll see, and that's a useful benchmark, but also your internal data. You know, Ogilvy is a global agency, and so we've got varying data points that we can take from our markets and use that as a reference to. But without that foundation, without that foundation, you're just honestly reinventing the wheel all the time.
And at some point, we're going to have conversations with procurement, haven't we? And somebody's sort of written in, so, you know, the difficulty in moving to a value-based approach is driven by procurement, who are interested in picking at every aspect of the cost. And how do you persuade them to focus on value? And how do you have a conversation with them? Because my question was going to be about how well accepted is this by procurement?
I will say that I think you could have a separate webinar just
procurement. I think we are going to, actually, but
on negotiation techniques. Yeah. But one thing I would say is that I often hear that it's procurement-led exercise, and you know, and that we're at the mercy of procurement, but it's a negotiation. Procurement are there to do a job, and as such, again, it's a gross generalization. Agencies should have the confidence to have objective conversations with procurement, and not take a more vendor role and accept what is effectively a point of view from procurement. But again, this is a very broad and.
Yeah, I mean, pre-pandemic, I had the joy to go to something called ProcureCon Marketing, which is basically for procurement people to go to. There's very little agencies there, and it's typically them talking to me about and talk about procurement and kind of benefits and various other bits and pieces. So the irony is that they actually like talking about deliverables or outputs, because then they know exactly what they're getting. You'll still have some procurement people who are, you know, they want to change, you know, how much we're going to pay for an account manager or whatever. But, you know, rate cards are genuinely quite known industry-wide. You know, you can get them from a number of people. As you know, Esther, there's lots of different sources for them. But talking about the outputs, for them, that's kind of the value in what they're getting. We see them wanting, you know, a taxonomy. We see them wanting to talk about, you know, that the value is quantifiable in the output. So there's, you know, you'd be surprised. We've actually got a graph that we show people, which is, you know, the first ton of procurement people asking for output-based pricing started in 2000 with Amex. Then Coca-Cola started with it. And what was it? 4 months ago, Coca-Cola announced globally that all of their agencies that they work with are now going to be on output-based pricing. So I think that move has already happened, because it's difficult, if not impossible, for them to compare. They can compare an hourly rate, but how many hours does it take for you to produce that thing? The two are disconnected. So procurement are working that out, and they're talking about it. And the narrative that we hear is that they're wanting agencies to move to output. Outcomes is different, because they feel like they're paying the agency, and they select the agency based on their skill and level, which is why I think you need to have a different discussion on the value that you can uplift over and above another agency. So, but you still need to move to the output piece.
Yeah, just to build on that, I think it's very important that agencies bring to the table the level of seniority needed to do the deliverables, because you know, you've got obviously differing layers, let's say in creative. You cannot expect to do a large complex campaign with more junior staff. And again, but it becomes a part of the broader conversation. The agency needs to help explain to procurement, to client, that team setup.
And ideally to have a relationship with very senior people at the client as well, to help smooth the way with procurement. So it's less about procurement, more about what this really senior person at the brand wants.
Yeah, and again, that's a negotiation, isn't it? It will take time.
Yeah, yeah. I'm conscious that you've going to have to go shortly, Ian. So are you able to sort of share with us how sort of thinking about things in this way has helped you in Ogilvy?
Yes, I mean, much of what we've talked about, Tracey and I have been working on the implementation of the scope tool, and just it's helping us, enabling us to get to better scoping. I think this has been very important for our teams. It's on our roadmap to develop the product further for Ogilvy. But much of what we talked about, focusing on the brief, focusing on the strategic value, that's been a focus for us. Definitely in the last 18 months. I think more importantly, it's about training our teams, whether they're traditional project management, they can be account management, just to pay more attention the moment that brief comes in, and then from that applying more rigor in how we're scoping and pricing. I think from a cultural perspective, we're always learning, so it's a iterative improvement. So we have a mindset of continuous improvement. Every day. I know this is a bit cliche, but every day is the opportunity to improve. So you start to think about applying more retrospectives at the end of projects to help inform the next brief. So all of these tactics are kind of helping us to deliver better for our clients.
Absolutely. I mean, somebody said here, surely the elephant in the room here is that the value-based selling, i.e. you can't change how you price while your agency is seen as a commodity. So unless you're meaningfully differentiated and critically change how you sell accordingly, then you'll struggle to earn the right to change the pricing conversation. I think there is some, truth in that, isn't there?
That's a great question. And I think so the word commodity, that's the key to transform, isn't it? But that's a great question.
Yeah. That's right. Wasn't very long questions in here. No. We've got some essays in here. Take me longer to read out than we've got time, I think.
Well, I think that means that that's a very good discussion, and I hope that we've given lots of food for thought around challenging the current norm and kind of how we got here, and changing the narrative, because it is around changing that narrative and making a move. And it might be one client that you start with, or it could be 3 clients. But as Ian said, it's about constant improvement to make this better. Because if we go back to the beginning, it's not my quote, I wish it was, it's McKinsey, that a 1% increase in your price is an 8% increase in profitability if nothing else changes. That's phenomenal. So we need to focus on how we get to that, and that's about talking, not about the input. This is about making it a movement to output. I know it's not easy, and even Ian mentioned, what he's talking about is change management with the teams. It's historical that pricing is left to the last minute, and we're running around and we're just putting numbers against roles in a spreadsheet. Which is why procurement pick up on it. It's more difficult to move to talking about the output, the thing. And Ian's gone again and again about the time it takes and the rigor it takes. But you need to have that up front if you want to make your agency more profitable. Fact. You can use tools to make that happen, and we believe that that's the mandate of where agency should be. But you can take this on as your own mantle to move the needle.
Ian, I'll let you go, because I think you did have a hard stop at 10:50. So thank you very much for joining us. I think we could have gone on for another hour, to be honest. There's so many questions on here. I've been trying to pick out the slightly shorter ones, but thank you so much for joining us. I'll let you go, but maybe Tracey, if you're able to stay for the next 10 minutes, maybe try and pick up some of the other questions.
Thank you so much, and thanks everybody for listening.
Thank you very much, Ian. Thank you. I mean, Tracey, maybe it's worth just talking to us a little bit about how the software you've developed can sort of actually practically help agencies with these challenges.
I'd love to, Esther. So, I mean, as I said, I came at this from having a very successful project management and workflow tool. And, that made me and the team feel great that we built that business and were very successful. And it definitely made margin point improvements, but it was really clear that this whole kind of pricing piece was something that was done, it's genuinely done too late, after the fact. You know, people are thinking about, you know, the creative idea and all the elements. And one of the things that's a kind of a personal challenge for me is that if a client gives us a budget, we meet that budget. Well, that's like going into the supermarket and saying, I have £200 to spend on my weekly shop, and getting all your weekly shop into the basket, and then going, oh, I haven't got enough, but I'll give it to you anyway. That doesn't happen. So no, so scope is a tool that's designed to help agencies to price for the work that they do better. We talk about outputs, it's underpinned by inputs. We don't believe that you should share those, the inputs with the client. It's got some very clever data and a taxonomy involved. We call that our baseline. You can use our baseline and amend it. This is around making sure that, you know, you can price the best way that you can for your client. So we even have clients that will have deliverable-based pricing for some, input-based pricing for others. You know, there's a mix, but it's really important that you need to start the journey to move, because that's where you'll find the profitability, and stopping the narrative that is, you know, talking about hours and roles, because, you know, an hourly rate, you can find those hourly rates anywhere, whether it be, you know, from the IPA or the 4As or, you know, the design council or whoever, you know, those, you know, you probably even have a list of what the recommended industry rates are. Yeah, so it's that the roles is irrelevant really when it's talking about the value and what the output is, and that's, you know, breaking that conversation. It's pretty easy when you, well, it's easy for me to say when you start it, but you'd be surprised how many times I've had agencies go, Tracey, this is going to be really difficult, and I'm like, just try it. Just go to one of your clients and try talking about what you can see if you're talking about outputs, how scope can manage those, you know, the documentation, even, you know, taking it from an Excel and a Word into one succinct thing, which is what we do really well, that you can present to the client. They love it.
So one of the questions here is, so do you recommend moving to standard prices for things like account management and content creation pieces? I mean, is this what we're talking about? Literally.
Yeah, absolutely. It doesn't mean you can't tweak it or change it. You start talking about those things, and you start with a price for an output. But it doesn't. You know, people always say to me, "Well, if I go to output pricing, I'm set the pricing." Hell no, of course you haven't. You know, you're just giving more narrative around what you're doing and the components that make all the tasks that make that up, and more narrative about them. So roles there's no value in saying I need, you know, 50 hours of an account manager and 50 hours of a project manager and 25 hours of a creative and 17 hours of a junior. And what does that mean? That doesn't mean anything. Whereas you say, okay, so we're going to do a content strategy, and as part of that, we're going to do some segmentation work. We're going to do some personas. We're going to do, we need to look at your current content and do a review. And all of those are the things that you're delivering as part of that content strategy. In our tool, a content strategy has 40 different options that you might choose of things. This is the taxonomy we have, and they'll have hours and rates associated with them. So your team can go, what is it that we're thinking about? It reminds them to upsell. We're then communicating that with the client. It's a whole different approach. So no, scope, we talk about things, but we talk about it in real detail with absolute rigor.
And somebody's asked, do you have a recommended approach for tracking outputs versus the hours that you input? And presumably your software can help with all of that as well.
Yeah, so we call that baselines, and we push, once the scope is created, we push that scope detail out to either a workflow system, and we integrate with a number of them, from Smartsheet to 10,000 feet to all of the usual suspects, and we bring time back. So you bring the time back to the individual deliverable. At the moment, you're spending all that time getting the team to fill in time, bring it back to the deliverable, and then you can inform that decision. I already know from running a project management workflow tool that most of the jobs were running over between 18 and 30%. So you should be tweaking those outputs or deliverables and increasing the value for them in the different areas of the tasks that are being done. And also scope creep. People are like, well, scope creep comes in. Well, scope creep is because you haven't scoped very well in the beginning and you haven't listed all the options. And if you list the things that you're delivering and the client wants you to deliver something else, it doesn't go back to the hours. Oh, I bought all these hours. I thought that would be included. No, you've given them a list of things that are included. So then you can charge more for that. So the big thing we see after scoping properly is they can get to charge more for the things that aren't included.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I apologise to all those people whose questions we haven't been able to answer. I think what I'm gleaning for this is that we almost need a completely separate session on value-based pricing on the outcomes side of things, because a lot of the questions are around that. I'm going to finish before I wrap with just a little example that somebody's written in. So going to end on a high. As a positive example, we were asked to look at some sponsorship strategy for a global brand. The hours-based pricing came in at 65,000. I asked, what is the value if we get this right for them? And the answer from the client was potentially they'll get millions of pounds out of it. So we went back with a £250,000 price tag, talked them through the outcomes, and they happily paid it. So that's a nice story of how thinking more about outputs and outcomes has almost quadrupled what the agency got out of that piece of work than had they've literally just gone in with, this is the number of hours it's going to take. So I think there's probably a lot more to talk about on the whole sort of value piece and the outcomes piece, but I will call that a wrap. I think give you all 2 minutes to pop to the bathroom before your next meeting. Thank you all so much for attending, and do look out for the next webinar in this series that we've got, which should be later this month, where Caroline Johnson will be talking about productization. So thank you very much, Tracey, for joining us, and thank you everybody. And we will be circulating some slides really, which just sort of summarise the things that Tracey and Ian have been talking about today to everyone who's attended. So hopefully that'll be helpful, and maybe you can share that with some of your colleagues as well. So thank you very much. I will say goodbye.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.